Okay, class. Recording take 2. Pero yung take 1, I already watched it. It's a valid video naman. Okay naman yung video. So I think I'm gonna upload that also. More of introduction lang yun. But I suggest you watch it also. Yan. So as I was saying before mag-brown out, yung in-upload ko na module as well as the activities related to that will be discussed later, no? Unahin ko lang itong nandito sa book kasi para may align natin yung discussion. Kasi yung module na yun and activities related to that, kung i-check nyo sa table of contents nitong book, I believe they can be found dito sa chapter 4, sort of, no? So, okay, proceed na ako. Kung mag-brown out po ulit. Okay, class. So, first topic to discuss, current liabilities. Ano? So, in this chapter, ang mga related standards in relation to this are the following. So, we have PAS 1, Philippine Accounting Standards 1, which is the presentation of financial statements. PAS 32, financial instruments presentation. And then PFRS 9 stands for Philippine Financial Reporting Standards 9, Financial Instruments. Okay. So these are the objectives for this chapter. First is to state the recognition criteria for liabilities. Second, identify the characteristics of a financial liability. Third, state the initial and subsequent measurements of financial and non-financial liabilities. And fourth, classify liabilities as current and non-current. So for this video, kung kaya hanggang learning objectives 2, tingnan natin. Pero as I was saying dun sa first video kanina, yung discussion ko is chunk siya, no? Naka-chunk siya, hindi siya isang bagsakan para madali nyo ma-download. So you could watch it also ng part by part siya. Okay, let's proceed. Okay, liability. So what is a liability? First year pa lang kayo. It has been discussed na on the Fundamentals of Accounting Part 1. Ayan, so it is a present obligation of the entity to transfer an economic resource as a result of past events. Ayan, class ano. So as I was saying, first year pa lang kayo. It has been discussed ng overview. Overview. So of course, familiar na kayo sa term na ito. So the definition of the liability has the following 3 aspects. So what are these 3? First, it must be an obligation. Second, there should be a transfer of an economic resource. And lastly, that obligation should be a present obligation that as a result of past events. Okay, so isa-isahin natin yung tatlong aspeto ng definition ng liability. So it is an obligation. So what is an obligation? It is a duty or responsibility of an entity in which that entity has no practical ability to avoid. So in Tagalog, hindi mo ito maiwasan na obligation. So ang common example lagi natin dito is yung mga debt, yung mga utang, di ba? Obligation. Ayan. So an obligation daw is either legal or constructive. So it is legal when it results from a contract, from a legislation or other operation of law. So kaya nga siya legal it's either from a contract or through operation of law. And then constructive obligation, ayan, of course, this is an obligation that does not arise from contract or operation of law, but it is resulted from an entity's actions. So example of those actions are past practice or published policies that create a valid expectation on others that the entity will accept and discharge certain responsibilities. Okay? So done with the first page. Wala naman ako masyadong notes. These are easily understandable discussions. Okay. So an obligation is always owed to another party. That's true. Kumbaga, for example, utang nga, di ba? Debt. So kung may utang, merong someone na merong right to that utang. So for example, sa ano nyo, sa law on obligations and contracts, di ba? For example, is debt. So, for example, ang obligation is debt. So, yung party natin, we have two parties there. We have the debtor and the creditor. So, yun. So, sa debtor, siya yung someone who owed the creditor. So, yung other party is the creditor who has the right to that obligation. Okay. Ito, inote natin dito, class. It is not necessary that the identity of that party is known. So, ibig sabihin daw dito, dun sa example natin na debtor and creditor. So, yung creditor, it is not necessary that the creditor is known. Ibig sabihin, kahit hindi mo alam yung creditor, okay lang yun. Okay lang yun sa obligation. So, example natin dito is an obligation for environmental damages that may be owed to the society at large. So, meron tayong example about it a little later. So, dito sa example, so this is just an elaboration of this. Itong mahabang to, this is just an elaboration of this paragraph which says lang na, yun nga, tingnan is there are two parties no sa obligation. Sige, basahin natin. For the sake of discussion, ito, no? So, one party's obligation normally corresponds to another party's right. Ayan. So, sa point of view ni debtor, obligation yon. Sa point of view ni creditor, right naman niya yun. No? So, for example, dito nga, for example, a buyer's obligation to pay an accounts payable of 100. So, normally, itong 100 pesos na to, this is an obligation of, ayan, the buyer to pay. On the other hand, sa seller naman is right naman niya to collect that 100 pesos. Okay? Sige. So class, disclaimer also, no? In the interest of time, saka in the interest of discussing this quite voluminous book, hindi ko i-discuss lahat yan. Ano? I leave the other paragraphs to you kasi hindi naman yan masyadong malalim. These are just examples for you to understand yung mga dinidiscuss na provision. Hindi, may note pala ako dito. Ito. Sige, tuloy ko to. However, this accounting symmetry, ulitin natin ang sabi kasi daw, one party's obligation normally corresponds to another party's right. So, if there's an obligation, dun sa other end, meron namang right. Okay? Pero ang sabi, this accounting symmetry, so yun yung binanggit kong yun, this is not maintained at all times. Kumbaga, that is not an absolute scenario. Hindi siya palaging ganun. Because the standards sometimes contain different recognition and measurement requirements for the liability of one party and the corresponding asset of the other party. Sige, example natin. Ito daw, direct origination costs result to different measurements of the lender's loan receivable and the borrower's loan payable. So, ano ba yung direct origination cost? So, sa mga umuutang, sa mga mangungutang, 'di ba, palagi may mga requirements to comply. Like yung mga documents to process, documents to fill out para makapag-avail of that loan. So, yung mga cost related to that, ang tawag natin doon in general is direct origination cost. So, sinasabi natin dito na ito yung example na hindi palaging yung obligation ay nagko-correspond to a party's right. Kumbaga may equal. Kasi dito kanina sa unang example, 100 yung pinag-uusapan, di ba? So 100 yung obligation ni buyer. On the other hand, 100 din yung right ni seller to collect. In this exemption, hindi daw pareho yung amount na ng obligation tsaka ng right. Siyempre, 'di ba, kadalasan kapag umuutang, 'di ba? For example, 1 million yung uutangin. So, 'di ba, nagbabawas lagi tayo doon ng mga origination costs, mga processing fee, minsan yung mga interest binabawas na rin, di ba? And then, to cut it short, let's just say si borrower, from that 1 million na loanable amount, ang marireceive lang niya, 950,000. So, sa point of view ni debtor, yung mangungutang ng 1 million, ang marireceive lang niya is 950. On the other hand, sa point of view naman ni nagpautang is 1 million plus interest pa. So, hindi na siya equal. Just like on this first example. Ano? So, yun yung gustong sabihin dito. Okay. Similarly, a seller may be required to recognize a warranty obligation, but the buyer would not recognize a corresponding asset for that warranty. So for this warranty, we have a separate discussion for this. Pero katulad ng unang example dito sa 1 million na utang. So ganun din yung gustong sabihin dito. Ano? Yung symmetry or yung concept na ito na one party's obligation normally corresponds to another party's right. Ayan. It's not always the case. Okay. Sige, too much for that. Let's proceed to another aspect. No? So nasa unang aspect pa lang tayo guys ng liability, which is the obligation. So let's proceed to the second aspect, which is the transfer of an economic resource. Ayan. Sige, basahin natin ng konti. Actually, understandable na to class, no? Transfer of an economic resource. So, yung liability daw is the obligation that has the potential to require the transfer of an economic resource to another party and not the future economic benefits that the obligation may cause to be transferred. Sige, pampagulo lang yung una. Ang gusto lang sabihin is if you have an obligation, kasunod nun is you have the entity. If the entity has an obligation, of course, that entity should transfer an economic resource to settle that liability, to settle that obligation. Okay? Thus, the obligation's potential to cause a transfer of economic benefits need not be certain or even likely. For example, the transfer may be required only if a specified uncertain future event occurs. What is important is that the obligation already exists and that in at least one circumstance, it would require the entity to transfer an economic resource. Ayan. Kasi class, dito papasok yung ano, no? Dito papasok yung another topics natin sa current liabilities such as provision and contingent liabilities na. Whereas kasi, hindi naman laging yung liability ay nag-i-exist or certain na nag-i-exist siya. Yung occurrence niya ay certain din, and then also the payment is measurable. Hindi laging ganun. Kaya meron tayong tinatawag na provision and contingent liabilities. More of those two sa mga future discussions natin. In the meantime, nandito pa lang tayo sa transfer of an economic resource. Okay. Proceed tayo. Ayan. Consequently, a liability can exist even if the probability of transfer of economic resource is low. Yeah, pwede ka pa rin magkaroon ng liability kahit yung transfer of economic resource is low. Yan. That's clear naman. Sige, proceed tayo dito. An obligation to transfer an economic resource may be an obligation to ito. So ito class yung mga example ng transfer of an economic resource. It could be through payment of cash, delivery of goods, or rendering of services, exchange assets with another party on unfavorable terms. Bakit siya unfavorable? Kasi nga, it is a liability that has to be settled. So of course, it is unfavorable for the entity to have an outflow of economic resource. Kaya siya unfavorable. If asset ang pinag-uusapan natin, edi it's just simply exchange assets with another party on favorable terms. Diba? Alam naman natin na mirror image yung assets at liabilities. Letter C, transfer of assets if a specified uncertain future event occurs. And letter D, issue a financial instrument that obliges the entity to transfer an economic resource. Okay. So ito class yung mga mode of transfer of economic resource. Okay, so we're done with the second aspect. We will proceed to the last aspect of liability, which says that the obligation should be a present obligation as a result of past events. And ibig sabihin, syempre, before ka magkaroon ng current obligation or ng present obligation, there should be a transaction from the past na naging cause kung bakit ka nagkaroon ng obligation. Ayan. So, okay. Ayan. A present obligation exists as a result of past events if, so may dalawang case daw, kung paano nagkakaroon ng present obligation as a result of past events. Una, the entity has already obtained economic benefits or taken an action. Sige. Letter B, as a consequence, the entity will or may have to transfer an economic resource that it would not otherwise have had to transfer. Ano daw? Okay. Sige. As a consequence, the entity will or may have to transfer an economic resource. Okay, that's true. Okay. Tama. Kumbaga ay, syempre, dahil nga nagkaroon ka ng transactions from past events, so ang tendency ni entity is to pay that obligation. Kasi kung wala namang ganong transactions from the past that obliges the entity to pay, edi wala kang dapat i-transfer na economic resource. Ayun. So, plus ano lang ha, just tip, marami sa accounting talagang mga nakakalulang mga statements, medyo yung sa unang basa hindi mo siya agad magigets. So ang diskarte lang dyan, basahin mo ulit, tapos ay try mo siyang himay-himayin, try mong namnamin yung binabasa mo. Kasi kung babasa, tapos dapat nasa mood ka ng pagbabasa. Dapat yung isip mo talagang you have in the right condition to understand and to comprehend what you are reading. Okay? So we have here several examples ng to know if the entity has an obligation. So we have several examples here. I believe there are 7. There are 7 examples. Okay. So, alamin natin kung meron bang obligations in the following examples. Okay, una. First example. Entity A intends to acquire goods in the future. So, tanong, may obligation na ba si Entity A? So, analyze natin. Sabi, Entity A has no present obligation. So a present obligation arises only when entity A has already purchased and received the goods. So take note of the letter A here, past tense, purchase and receive the goods. Doon sa example natin, si entity A are just intending, gusto pa lang niya, nagpaplano pa lang siya mag-acquire ng goods in the future. So wala pang nangyayaring purchase, wala pang nangyayaring receive of goods. Therefore, entity A has no obligation yet. Okay. Ito, example, letter B. Entity B operates a nuclear power plant. Ayan. In the current year, a new law was enacted penalizing the improper disposal of toxic waste. No similar law existed in prior years. So, tanong, may obligation na ba si entity B? Let's proceed to the next page. Okay, anyway, answer here is no. Wala pang obligation si entity B. So, bakit? Let's analyze. So, the enactment of legislation is not in itself sufficient to result in an entity's present obligation except daw. So, Tagalogin kong klase na. Sabi dito, in the current year, ano law was enacted? So, yung enactment na yon ng law, hindi siya sufficient, hindi siya sapat para magkaroon ng obligation yung si entity B. Okay? Pero, Magkakaroon ng obligation si entity B if, ito, we have two examples here, if the entity had already taken an action action contrary to the provisions of that law. Of course, now, if there's a law and then you violate it, most likely may obligation ka. Hindi lang obligation, may penalty ka pa, may punishment ka pa. And then letter B, as a consequence, the entity will have to pay for a penalty. Ayan. Pakabanggit ko lang. Okay, so ito guys yung sagot. Accordingly, entity B has no present obligation. Ayan, ano. So, easily understandable naman ito. Iwan ko na sa inyo ito, ha? Okay, example number 3. Entity C enters into an irrevocable commitment with another party to acquire goods in the future on credit. Ulitin natin. Entity C enters into an irrevocable. Ano ba yung irrevocable? Ang ibig sabihin ng irrevocable ay irreversible. Okay? Irrevocable. Ang root word ng irrevocable is revocable or revoke. Pag sinabing revoke, ibig sabihin, pwedeng bawiin. Since irrevocable siya, hindi pwedeng bawiin. So, ayan, ano. Other term dito is non-cancelable. Ayan. So, si entity C daw has entered into a non-cancelable commitment with another party to acquire goods in the future on credit. Tanong, may obligation na ba? Sagot, wala pa din. Ano? Wala pa din. Kasi future pa naman eh. Kumbaga, meron lang siyang commitment na bibili siya ng goods in the future. Pero hindi pa talaga siya bumibili. Kaya wala pa siyang obligation. Okay, so okay na yan. Okay na yan. I think sapat na yung ano ko na yan. Discussion ko na yan for that. Punta tayo sa letter D. Ayan, so ito sa letter D, example number 4. Although not stated in the sales contract, entity D has a publicly known policy of providing free repair services for the goods it sells. Entity D has consistently honored this implied policy in the past. So, ang tanong, may obligation na kaya? So, ayan. So, for the first time, this example is may obligation na si entity D. Ang tawag natin dito is constructive obligation. Ayan, ano. So, sige, basahin natin. Entity D has a present constructive obligation to provide pre-repair services for the goods it has already sold. Because po yun? Because, yeah, entity D has already taken an action by creating valid expectations on the customers that it will provide pre-repair services, and letter B, as a consequence, entity D will have to provide those pre-services. Okay, that's it. Okay, we have 3 examples pa. So, that's yung letter D, meron na silang obligation, ha? Letter E, example, entity E obtained a loan from a bank. The payment of the loan is due in 10 years' time. So, plus, this is easily understandable. Nangutang, may utang na. So, may obligation na to pay. Okay na yan. Letter F, entity F has caused environmental damages, although no law exists penalizing such act. Entity F believes it has an obligation to rectify the damages. However, the identity of the party to whom the obligation is owed cannot be specifically identified. So si F class, meron na siyang obligation. It's just yung other end in which the entity has an obligation is hindi siya known pa. Hindi pa siya specific kasi environmental damage ito eh. So most likely, it is the community in which the business is located. Yun. So yun class ang sinasabi natin dun sa example natin kanina, ano, na it's not necessary that the identity of the party is known when it comes to obligation. Ayan. So, nandun yung class sa, ano, sa page 2. Ayan, sige, balikan nyo na lang. Okay, last, entity G employed Mr. Juan. Ang tanong, may obligation na ba? Answer is no. Wala pang obligation. Unemployed lang. So, si entity G, siya yung employer. Si Mr. Juan, yung kanyang employee. So, unemployed niya. Kumbaga, parang hinire niya. So, wala pa. Wala pang obligation dito. Bakit? Wala pa. Unless, si Mr. Juan is nag-render na siya ng service niya. Kung nag-render na siya ng service niya, sabihin natin after a month, edi dapat na siya sumweldo, di ba? So, si entity G as employer, meron na siyang obligation to pay remuneration to Mr. Juan. So, that is the case. Ano? Okay, those are the 7 examples. I-highlight lang natin dito. Ano? Sinabi kasi dito, ayan, sige, basahin ko. Entity G has no present obligation until Mr. Juan has rendered services. So that's what I was saying earlier. Before then, the contract is executory. So ano ba ibig sabihin ng executory contract? So mayroon naman definition dito yan. So ano lang siya? Sige, basahin ko din. Hindi ako law expert, kaya basahin natin. Pero I believe if you have undergone law and obligations and contracts, na-encounter nyo ito. So an executory contract is a contract that is equally unperformed. Okay, so may kontrata daw, whereas yung dalawang parties is wala pa silang na-render na kahit anuman. Wala pang na-perform. Ayan. Therefore, wala pang obligation for each of them. Ayan. Or pwede rin yung executory contract ay meron daw partial fulfillment ng obligation to an equal extent. Okay? An executory contract establishes a combined right and obligation to exchange economic resource. And medyo mahaba ito, class. Explain ko na lang in my own words. Ano? Dito sa executory contract kasi, yun nga we have 2 parties. Si G as employer, si Mr. Juan as employee. So, since dito, in-employ ko lang si Mr. Juan, wala pang obligation. Wala pa rin silang claim sa isa't isa. Once si Mr. Juan, nag-start na siya mag-render ng service, so sa part ni Mr. Juan, yung, di ba, nag-effort na siya. Yung labor niya, nag-start na din. So, sa part niya, meron na siyang expectation na Mr. Juan will be paid in the future in the form of remuneration. So, sa part ni Mr. Juan, nagkakaroon siya ng tinatawag na, anong term na ginamit niya dito? Asset. Parang meron siyang receivable. On the part of entity G, since nag-render na ng service si Mr. Juan, so nagkakaroon naman siya ng liability. Payable naman. No? So that could be salaries payable. So si Mr. Juan, salaries, not necessarily salaries receivable. Normally kasi ano lang yun cash yung marireceive niya. Kasi hindi naman inutang ni entity J yung kanyang service. Nag-render siya ng service niya kasi employee siya. Anyway, it's just asset and liability para mas madali yung usapan natin. So, ganun lang, class. Ganun lang yung gustong sabihin dito. Okay. O, ito. Advances to employers. Iba pa yan. Salary na lang. Okay. So, that's it. We're done with the third aspect of the liability, no, which is the present obligation as a result of past events. So, ang haba nun, definition pa lang yung class. So, let's proceed to the next topic, recognition criteria. Ayan. So, this is page 7, pero page 6 sa libro. Page 7 nga, same lang. So, just for your information, itong recognition criteria, it is the first learning objective of the chapter. So, balikan natin ng konti ha. Lipat ko yung aking ayan no. So, ilang minuto na yung lumipas, pero wala pa pala tayong nadi-discuss na na learning objective. Itong mahirap kapag PDF. Ito kaso, learning objectives. Nandito pa lang. Ang number 1 is state the recognition criteria. So yung diniscuss natin ng ilang minuto na, wala pa tayong na-hit na learning objectives. So let's start. Discuss na natin yung recognition criteria. Ayan, okay. So, an item is recognized if it meets the definition of a liability. So, yan, yung definition, diniscuss natin. Ano yung under that definition, there are three aspects, which is, which are obligation, transfer of an economic resource, at saka obligation as a result of past events. No, present obligation as a result of past events. So, na-discuss na natin yun. Okay na yun. So, letter B naman, recognizing it would provide useful information. So, example, relevant and faithfully represented information. So, for the item daw to be recognized, dapat yung dalawang criteria must be met. Okay? Both ha, dapat ay both. Not, hindi or, hindi siya one, hindi siya yung or, dapat ay and. Silang dalawa dapat. Okay? So, sa inyo na to, bigay ko na sa inyo. Ayan, so hina-highlight dito yung relevance. So, sa relevance, recognition may not provide relevant information if, ayan, so ito daw. It is uncertain whether the liability exists or nag-exist ng liability pero yung probability of an outflow of economic benefits is low. Ayan, so this is as to relevance. Ano? Okay. In here, existence uncertainty or low probability of an outflow of economic resource may result in but does not automatically lead to the non-recognition of liability. Other factors should be considered. Ayan, so class, ito yung sinasabi ko na yung strategy ng pag-discuss, nakadepende yan sa author, kung paano niya i-discuss. So, yung mga ganito, it could be said simply Pero sige, pasimplayin natin. Di ba nga, as to relevance, is ang concern kasi natin dito is, yun bang existence nung liability is certain. So, pwedeng certain, pwedeng uncertain. And then, ngayon, kung nag-i-exist man yung liability, yun bang outflow of economic resource, is it probable or not? So when it comes to probability, it could be low probability, it could be high probability, or it could be unprobable, non-probable at all. So yun. Ang sinasabi dito, yung daw mga yun is hindi naman necessary. It does not necessarily mean na if hindi mo yun na-meet, hindi mo na i-recognize yung liability. Marami pong factors na dapat i-consider when it comes to recognition of an item. In this case, a liability. Okay? Yun lang yan. So, faithful representation, di ano lang naman ito, no? Faithfully represented. Sige, basahin natin. Inang muna ako. So, a liability must be measured for it to be recognized. So, yan. Sinabi natin class measured or measurement. This is, we assign value to that item. In this case, liability. Sabihin, ma-measure, bago mo daw ma-recognize yung liability, dapat ma-measure mo muna siya. Ibig sabihin, may peso value. Okay? Kaya lang, ang problema, class, yun kasing measurement, hindi yan laging andyan. Kumbaga, hindi yan laging available. For example, sabihin natin na meron si entity A, meron siyang liability na 1 million. So, yung 1 million pesos, 1 million na yun, yun. Na-measure natin yung liability na it is amounted to 1 million. Yun yung sinasabing nating measurement. So, dapat daw, for that liability to be recognized, dapat ma-measure natin siya. Kaya nga lang, yung measurement, hindi siya palaging certain. Kaya, if that is the case, we have to use estimates. Ayan, ito. The use of reasonable estimates. So, yan. Sige, madidiscuss natin yan further later when it comes to, to provision. Ito yung provision ang pinag-uusapan dito. Okay. So, I don't know kung ilang minuto na. Pero, Lobat yung laptop ko. Sige, hanggang doon na lang muna. So, para din ma-upload ko na rin ito right away. Tsaka i-charge ko muna yung laptop ko. Ano? Okay, so see you sa part 3 of the discussion of chapter 1. So, in the meantime, ito muna. I'm gonna upload this to my YouTube channel. So, share ko lang. Share ko lang. Ano lang naman yun? Hindi naman yun, ano ba? Di pa yun ganun kabongga. Pero at least, in the future, baka mapakinabangan. Sige class, yun na lang muna for this video.